Well, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Text Messages, podcast at a First Christian Church of Huntington Beach. My name is Stephen Pate. I'm on staff here at the church. I'm joined with our lead pastor, Scott Martin. How you doing, Scott?
I'm good, Stephen. How you doing, man?
Doing pretty good, man. Excited to hang out and have another conversation. This is actually episode 9. So there we go. And it's February. We are in the second month of 2021. And, before we get started, I feel like we have to talk just a little bit about the Super Bowl. It just happened. So did you watch? Did you participate? What did you think of the game?
I love football. It's my favorite sport to watch. It's a lot of fun. I actually did not watch the Super Bowl this year. And it wasn't like a protest or anything like that. I just, we had originally had camping reservations, and then they got canceled, but then they got reopened. So we actually went camping in Joshua Tree.
Nice.
I did. I'd pull out my phone every now and then and check on it, because I was curious about the score and everything. And I watched a bunch of stuff, ESPN highlights and everything when I came back. But actually, this is the first time I was even in India one year and we watched the Super Bowl.
Wow.
So this is the first time I remember not watching it.
It was an okay game, right? I mean, I don't know if you're a fan of either team or, if you had really a lot of stake in it. I guess it's interesting to see Tom Brady win another Super Bowl ring. Maybe it's not, but it happened.
It's impressive. Like, whether you like the guy or not, whether you root for him or not, to see someone do that, like at that level, it's an impressive thing to watch. We should all at least feel honored that we get to see that kind of champion, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, it gives me hope in my life too, that he's like 43 and still doing that. I mean, goals, right? Something to strive for.
You got time, bro. Don't worry about it.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, besides the Super Bowl, February is a month that has, just a lot of things going on. And one of the things is that it is typically known as the month of love, and that's because of Valentine's Day. Now, something that you and I have talked about a lot before is the fact that we both used to be youth pastors. And that's kind of an interesting subculture, like within church and Christianity. And if you have never participated in youth group yourself, or maybe you haven't had kids in it, it's just kind of seems like a weird thing, but it's almost like this group, and there's sorts of like shared fun activities and just kind of like interesting histories that are shared across churches. And we always kind of talk about that, but I'm wondering, when it comes to like Valentine's Day or like February, do you remember anything from your time as a youth pastor, any message series that you did or any events that took place during this month that were kind of memorable, that make you laugh to this day? Just anything that comes up for you.
It was funny. We used to always do relationship themed things. I mean, that's important for everybody. We still do it now in the adults usually, but with students we would do like relationship themed things. We'd talk about that, and right around Valentine's Day we would always have fun. We'd play like versions of the dating game or things like that, have little kind of parties. But one thing I remember is, when you have a group of students that gathers together every week, is you do have a few couples in there, and so for the couples in there, they do their thing. But in youth ministry is when I learned about Singles Awareness Day, is what one of the students called it one time. Is we'd actually, I remember having groups of students that would just go out together on Valentine's Day to like just embrace their I'm single and I'm proud, and so we'd always kind of, it was never got too romantic when we would do things, because most people in the youth group didn't have a boyfriend or girlfriend, but we'd always have fun and play little games and kind of just have fun on a Valentine's Day. What about you? Did you guys ever do anything fun?
Yeah, I mean, that's similar to us. We always did whatever series we were going through. It was like a love series. We talk about dating and relationships, and we used to do a Q&A with students during this series, and it was kind of like a big deal where students could ask any questions, and we'd have different leaders or parents kind of ask them or answer them. And I remember that we had students text in, like we do that now at FCC, and there was this kid that was just texting in these questions, and he was literally asking me how to break up with his girlfriend, who was also part of the youth group. And like, it was clear what he was doing. And I'm like, we're not gonna like answer these. We're not gonna help you do that right now. But just things like that, like crazy antics, I'll never forget those.
That's awesome.
Good times
Yeah.
in history. Well, speaking of it being February, talking about love, I have a question for you. But first, I want to read a passage from the New Testament in a book called First John. And this is in First John 4, starting in verse 10, read a few verses, then I'm going to ask you the question.
Okay.
All right, this is what John writes, First John. He says, "This is love, not that we loved God, but that God loved us and sent his son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is made complete in us. This is how we know that we live in him and he in us. He has given us his spirit. And we have seen and testified to the Father who has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in them and they in God. And so we know and rely on the love God has for us." And then he says, "God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them." So, my question, Scott, just a really simple question is, what is love? There it is.
Every time I hear that, I just think of that song from Saturday Night Live. Like
Yes.
they go like, "What is love?" And they're like, "Okay."
Baby, don't hurt me. Yep.
One thing, and I know we're gonna get into this, but one thing I think is important to remember right from the very front is First John is a letter that's written by John, the Apostle John.
Mhm.
So this is a guy who's friends with Jesus. He walks with Jesus for 3 years. He watches Jesus die. He's there when he resurrects. Like he sees all of that.
Mm.
And so what John is writing about God, he's writing through the lens of Jesus.
Mm.
And I think it makes it, at least for me, it makes what John says here that much more powerful because as John is trying to sum up at this point, like, who is God? Based on what I have seen in Jesus, who is God? And the word he uses to sum, he could have used any word. He could have said God is anything. God is great. God is amazing. God is awesome. God is
Right.
powerful. God is whatever. But the word he uses is love.
Mm.
That, and I think John would use a lot of other words to describe what Jesus is like. Jesus was Jesus demonstrated. But the one word, like, if I'm going to sum up my experience of God through Jesus, is love. And I think that's powerful because again, this guy's an eyewitness. This is what he's saying based on his experience. This is who God is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an important perspective to have when we're reading through that. And I asked that question kind of in a joking manner because it's so big, obviously, and there's so many different ways you could go with it. But we just wanted to talk a little bit about like what is this love that we really have in God, and how do we discover that within the text of Scripture, and kind of diving in. And so I want to do that from kind of just here in First John, but then sort of going into the Old Testament and then kind of coming to the New Testament, the person of Jesus, so that we might just understand what is love really all about? How do we understand that? How do we live in that? So let's start with just kind of the Old Testament, thinking about sort of what do we find out about love in the Old Testament, like with Hebrew thought. What does God say about love then? And then we'll kind of make our way towards Jesus.
Perfect.
So as we begin, what are some of the pictures or images that we have as we kind of start in the beginning of the Bible in the Old Testament that uncover love, that share a little bit about who God is and the kind of love that he has for his people?
Yeah. One of the things that I actually didn't know prior to this, but I did it like looking up because, Stephen is obviously you are in charge of the podcast and you kind of
Mhm.
put together a lot of the stuff. But I really didn't realize the Old Testament's written in Hebrew.
Uh-huh.
And one of the big words for Hebrew for love, the root word is actually to give.
Hmm.
And so if you know anything about Hebrew, I had to take Greek and Hebrew, and I took them, and I find them fascinating. I know how to research them, but I'm not great at them.
Right.
But Hebrew words all come from a three-consonant root, and so the whole root of that word love in Hebrew is to give.
Wow.
That's what it is at its heart. Which, if you go back to what you just read in John, John talks about that. We know what love is because God gave us His Son, and that's what's rooted in there. And it's defining love. I think the conversation we're having now is really important because I've said this before, and people say this all the time, and we're going to talk about this a little more. But we use the word love so much.
Right.
Like I love my wife, I love my children, I love pizza, I love
Yeah.
I love football. And it's like we know what we mean when we say that, but at the same time, like I don't feel the same way about pizza that I do about my wife. I don't feel the same way about, my children that I do about football or sports.
Mhm.
And so
Right.
kind of like understand because even, we always debate like, well, is love a verb? Is it a noun? Is it a
Mm.
feeling? Because when we're dating someone, we'll usually say, "Oh, I don't love you anymore," if we're gonna break up with them.
Right.
But what we mean is it's a feeling.
Yeah.
Like I don't feel fondness towards you. Um, but at the same time, if you're going to accuse someone of not loving you, you're typically accusing them of not acting a certain way toward you.
Mm.
Not feeling like, hey, you're not acting lovingly toward me means you're being me. And so even the way we use it, sometimes we use it as a verb, sometimes we use it as a noun. But that's why I love that in the root of that Old Testament word is give, that it is something that you do. It's
Yeah.
not just a way that you feel. It reminds me of Bob Goff, his book. He wrote a book called Love Does.
Oh yeah, love does.
Yeah, that just love does things.
Yeah.
It's not just this feeling. And so I love that in Hebrew that is at the root of it.
Mm.
That at the root of love is I'm going to give something. I would argue that love is ultimately giving ourselves to someone, but the idea of love is I'm giving something to you. I just think that's a beautiful picture, and I didn't know that before. A couple days
Yeah,
ago.
no, that's really fascinating, especially when you think of how God initiates this relationship that he has with his people. So start in the Old Testament and he enters into that relationship and he calls Abram and says, "Hey, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Like I'm going to be with you, I'm going to be for you." And he is initiating that idea of giving and love. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So do
Yeah,
we
and to go on with that, like you see that in all those Old Testament stories that God is giving. I mean,
yeah,
ultimately, it starts with creation. I mean, God creates and then He gives it to people. And then in the
yeah.
Exodus story, like it's God who gives people freedom. Like that's at the heart of it is God is always giving to people.
Hmm. So as we look at some of those stories, and I know there's a ton of them obviously to choose from, we kind of see that in action, right? God giving of himself, like he's doing something on behalf of his people. That love really is demonstrated by his reaching out, by something he's doing. So that says something about God, but then as you're saying, it also says something about the way that we show love, the way that we experience love in our lives as well.
Yeah. And I even think when you get into the Old Testament, like God does things out of love. He's motivated out of love. Like he gives creation out of love. He frees people out of love. He saves people out of love. But there's also that expectation that listen, God's going to do this whether or not people fulfill their end of the bargain. But if as people, if our relationship with God is going to continue to go on, there's expected to be some amount of like reciprocity.
Right.
Like God creates and gives us creation, like, and he's whatever the consequence is, he's going to do that. But if we're going to continue in this loving relationship with God, that means that we have to respond in love.
Mm.
And we see that in our own life too, that we can I mean, if you remember back to crushes that you had when you were in high school or even college or something before, like you can like someone, you can love someone, but if they don't feel the same way back to you, if they don't respond the same way back to you, you're not really going to have any kind of
Right.
healthy, meaningful relationship. I mean, one-way relationships don't work. And so, and John even says that in the part of First John that you wrote. He says,
Mm.
"We love because God first loved us."
Yeah.
That it starts with, and I think that's important too to remember when we talk about love. That ultimately we don't define love; God defines love
Mm.
because it starts with Him. John says, "God is love." He shows us what love is, and so rather than make up our own definitions of love, like look at what God, and at the heart of God is this: I'm going to give, I'm going to give, I'm going to give. But if we want to continue in any kind of healthy relationship with God, we've got to give back a little bit. And in the Old Testament, you see
Mm.
that in the idea of covenant.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about what covenant is? I mean, big idea that we find throughout the Bible, but also one of those things that we're like, what does this really mean? Like for me, what did it kind of mean for God's people? I mean, why covenant? Why was that an important thing?
Yeah, well, I don't know about when you were in college, but when I was in college, there was like a whole class we took that really just dealt around like covenant and the idea of covenant. And even when I went back to graduate school, that was like a big theme.
Like what the Bible
Yeah,
says about covenant, and it was just
yeah, all that.
diving into that.
Yeah. A covenant is a special kind of relationship.
Hmm.
And it's a relationship that two parties willingly enter into. And it's a commitment that two parties make to one another. Whenever we talk about covenant now, we usually talk about marriage
Hmm.
because marriage is the one clear covenant that we have. Two people stand before their friends, they stand before God, they make promises to love, honor, and cherish. That's at the heart of a covenant. Two parties are going to stand there. They're going to make commitments toward one another, and they're going to make promises. And as long as they fulfill those promises, the covenant goes well. And if they don't fulfill those promises, the covenant falls apart. But the whole point of the covenant is to kind of bind these two parties together.
Mm,
And so covenant language is used, it's used some in the New Testament, like Jesus will talk about it when he introduces communion. He'll say, this is my new covenant.
right.
But it's used all over the Old Testament, that God enters into covenants. He does it, with Abraham, and he does it through the Exodus, and he does it with David. And it's his binding of himself to his people, that we're going to enter into this and we're going to have this committed relationship. And here's what I'm going to do for you. But if the covenant's going to work, here's how you have to respond
Mm,
to me. And so it is that, like, yeah, God freely gives, and he's going to because of his love for us. But if we want to continue to live in that relationship with God, we've got, basically, we can't be a drag. I mean, it can't be this one way thing where one gives. So we have to give something too. That's the idea of covenant.
yeah. Yeah. It's that partnership, that relationship that God is entering into with us. And I mean, there obviously is a huge connection when we talk about marriage in the Bible, and even how it describes that, as really reflecting that relationship between Jesus and the church, between God and his people. And so there's that sense of that intimacy and that love and that connection. But I think one of the things that's so important within that is realizing that God has initiated that. And then there's this response. Like, we don't just give God like unrequited love. Like, if we're in that relationship with him, then there is that response of our faithfulness to him, like our desire to know him. And there's this other word, and we talked a little bit about Hebrew, but there's this other Hebrew word that is an incredible word, the word hesed, right? And this is a huge thing throughout the Old Testament. What this word means, sometimes it's translated as unfailing love or mercy, or loving kindness. But this really kind of is at the heart of that covenant about who God is. Could you say a little bit about kind of what this word means, and sort of what that means in terms of that covenant, or what that means in terms of God's incredible love that he has?
Yeah. Hesed is the word that's used. When you translate it, most of the time it's translated as loving kindness,
Mm-hmm.
is like how you would theoretically translate it. But the idea behind covenant is like, when God enters into a covenant with us, with human beings, with people, he does it in such a way that he is going to do everything he can to help us fulfill our end of the covenant.
Mm,
That it's not just like, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. Sometimes that's how covenant can feel. Like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do mine, you're going to do yours. And it's like this mutually beneficial thing. But again, the whole idea of covenant is rooted in love. It's rooted in this loving kindness. And so we're going to keep our end of the covenant. God's going to keep his end of the covenant in such a way that it like is beneficial to the other person. To me, like the ultimate example of this, there's this weird story in Genesis 15, where God is interacting with Abraham, and God tells him to get all these animals and to cut them in half and line them up. And the reason he tells him to do that is, in the ancient world, that's actually how you would make a covenant, like an actual, when you entered into a covenant. And the whole idea was, then the two parties that were making a covenant, they'd walk together in between these animals. And basically the pledge is, may I become like these animals if I don't fulfill my end of the covenant. May I be like cut in half. But the weird thing about that story is, Abraham prepares the animals, he cuts them in half, they're separated. And then I can't remember if he falls asleep or passes out, but like Abraham's like unconscious somewhere.
uh-huh.
And this pot of fire appears, which is a symbol for God. And God walks between the animals by himself.
Wow.
And so the idea is that God is going to fulfill this covenant regardless of what Abraham does. That God is going to ensure that this loving relationship that they're entering into, that it's going to be fulfilled. And God's even going to make sure that Abraham's part gets fulfilled. And so it's this powerful statement that it's not just God saying, you better do this or I'm going to strike you down. It's, no, I'm freely entering into this loving relationship with you. And I'm doing it in such a way that even if you can't fulfill your end of the bargain, I'm going to fulfill your end. And I'm going to carry you, and I'm going to make sure that we get through this and that we endure, and that this covenant we're entering into happens. And so it's really easy to get legalistic with the idea of covenant, but it's important to understand that even in ancient Israel, it's rooted in this again, this like self-sacrificial giving.
Yeah.
Not,
Wow.
at no point does God say you have to earn my love, so you better fulfill your end of the covenant. It's no. Covenants always are initiated by God. God's always giving, and He's always giving in such a way that it invites us to respond.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's an amazing story, and just an amazing picture of who God is, and that incredible love and that giving love that he has for us. So as we kind of think through some of those examples we have in the Old Testament of God and establishing the covenant with his people, we kind of move towards the New Testament, and we see obviously a continuation of that in the arrival of Jesus and how that changes some things. But we also have just some different ways to understand love in the New Testament when we think about Greek culture that now, Jesus is ministering, in Israel, and there's Greek influence, right? And then the early church is for the Israelites, but it's also expanding to the known world, which included different ways to understand things, like in the Greek world. So there are these different words that reflected love in kind of Greek thought. So they're kind of famous words. A lot of people have probably heard of them before, but that way we can kind of dive in and think about those a little bit before we look at sort of what Jesus's primary teaching was regarding love. So the four loves. C.S. Lewis famously wrote a book about the four loves. You have storge, which was like family love, and you have phileo, which is like friendship, brotherly love. Then you have eros, which is like romantic love, and then you have agape, which is the highest form of love. So just kind of thinking through those four things. I mean, what can we say more kind of about those four loves, or how they interact, or how's God connected to those four things? If there's anything you could add to that.
Yeah, I think in some ways those different words are helpful for exactly the reason that we just talked about. That in our language we use the same word to talk about pizza and our
Right.
spouses. Where at least in Greek, because you have those different words, it is clear like what you're talking about. Like if
Mm,
I was going to tell my wife Linda that I loved her, I would probably use eros, or I might use agape. But if I
mhm.
was going to tell you, hey Stephen, I love you, I would use phileo, which is where we get the word Philadelphia, city of
Mhm.
brotherly love. Eros is where we get erotic, and so in some ways it's helpful because it does kind of help us distinguish between, well, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah.
Because again, I do love my friends, and I do love my wife, and I do love my mom and dad, and I do love pizza, but I love all those things differently.
Mm,
So it does kind of help put some context into exactly what you're talking about, and what you mean. But I do think it's important to remember that ultimately all of that in some way flows from God.
mm,
That even though there's all these different breakouts, that like, because even again, if you go back in the Old Testament, there's this really weird book called Song of Songs or Song of Solomon
right.
sometimes, and it's this super really erotic like poem between a love and a lover. But a lot of that too is there's some imagery of that between God and people. That at its heart, it's a poem, it's a erotic love poem. Uh,
Mhm.
but all of that ultimately comes out of God's love for his people. So even though you have these different words to describe these different kinds of love, ultimately all of that love is still a gift from God. And as much as those different Greek words, don't necessarily apply to the way, like you wouldn't use eros to talk about the way God loves us or the way that we love God, but the love that I have for my wife, I mean, New Testament writers talk about, they use marriage as an example of Jesus and the church and how he,
Mhm.
so all of that still kind of is rooted in God's love, even though it manifests itself in our life in different ways and different relationships.
Yeah, yeah, that's helpful. I think we need some new words for love. I mean, I want to figure out what that word for pizza love is, because that might be very helpful to come up with that distinction. So when we think about Jesus in love, what would you say was Jesus's primary teaching regarding love? Just when we look at his life, look at his teaching, and how might we understand that?
So for a bulk of his ministry, his focus is on the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, he's asked, what's the most important law? How do you summarize the law? How do you do all of that? And I mean, he brings it down to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And he tells that, I mean, he tells different stories about that. He's asked, who is my neighbor? And he tells the Good Samaritan. That's a story about love. And so for most of his ministry, that's how he defines it. Love your neighbor as you would love yourself. Do for others. It's kind of, we even call it the golden rule. We word
Mhm.
it in different ways. Do for others the way that you would have them do for you. We teach our kids. But then what's interesting is at the Last Supper, and we talk about this all the time at church, but Jesus, as he's talking to his apostles, he tells them, he says, "A new command I give you."
Yeah.
And then he says, "Love others the way that I have loved you."
Mm.
And so to me, at that point, he raises the bar even a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, sometimes there's criticism on that because some people look at it and go, "Well, what if I don't love myself? What if I hate myself? Does that mean I can hate my neighbor?"
Yeah.
But the idea is, in most circumstances, we care about ourselves, we value ourselves, we're going to make decisions that protect and honor ourselves. So we should do that for other people.
Mhm.
But Jesus, when he says, "A new command I give you," in John, during it's in John, he takes it to a whole new level and just says, "Okay, this is even more than that."
Mm.
Because I'm about to give my everything for you. I'm going to put myself in harm's way. I'm going to give up everything for you. And this is what I want you to do for others. And so with his crucifixion, he takes that and he elevates that to a whole new level. But I think had he just showed up in the very beginning and said, "Hey, I want you to die for everybody," everybody would have been like, "Whoa."
Yeah,
But
yeah.
he kind of builds on this foundation of, because he got that love your neighbor as yourself. It's from the Old Testament.
Right.
He doesn't create it, but then he elevates it and takes it even one step further.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating part of the Gospel of John when Jesus is laying all that out. Greater love has none than this, and lay down your life for your friends. And we see him do that, and then all of a sudden there's this new ethic for how Christians are living, where we're saying, hey, it's not about me, but I'm going to actually lay down my life for you. Sometimes literally, sometimes just kind of in what I want, what I need. Like looking out towards another person. Would you say, I mean, you just kind of mentioned that, but I think about like some of the stories that Jesus told. Would you say that maybe there's a story, a parable that Jesus teaches that kind of epitomizes that idea of laying down one's life? You can think of in the Gospels.
Yeah, I think the Good Samaritan is always a great one.
Hmm.
I think one of the ones too, when you're talking about showing the love of God or the love of Jesus, is the prodigal son.
Yeah.
I think that's just a great, because I think the whole point of that story is Jesus is trying to show people what is the heart of God. Because here's a story eh, about a father whose son totally disrespects him, and the father would have been humiliated in the eyes of the culture, and they
Mhm.
would have expected him to write his son off, but he doesn't. And essentially the father bears the pain of the son's sin,
Mm.
so that when the son comes home, the father can rebuild the relationship. And
Wow.
so you have that idea of, here is a loving father bearing the pain and humiliation of the son's choices so that there can be restoration. And
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
probably the clearest picture of, going back to that idea of giving, that the father, "I'm going to give you anything.
Mm.
I'm going to give you everything that I am in order to have this relationship with you." And so I think that really, I think the point of that, a lot of times we focus on the sons and we try to identify with one of the sons, but I think the bigger point that Jesus is saying in the prodigal son is, here's the heart of a loving, giving
Mm.
God for you, his people.
And we're invited to become like the Father, right, in our own lives, in the way that we love and accept in what we do for other people. Wow, love that. That maybe it's one of the most popular stories, if not the most popular story. I feel like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, and Luke's Gospels, those might be Jesus's most famous stories. But just the heart of the gospel, we find it in both of those. Wow, that's really powerful. All right, so as we kind of wrap up this idea of what is love, we have kind of how God showcases love through covenant in the Old Testament, through his relationship with his people, through Jesus and what his teaching was of how to lay down our lives. And then we move into the church and this new community that exists of men and women from different backgrounds and coming together all of a sudden to form this new family and this new community. So how is love described in the community of the church when we see that beginning? Like how did they understand what it meant to love one another?
Yeah, it's described a lot when you read the early chapters of the book of Acts, especially.
Yeah.
And it's described almost like with this utopian language of everybody's together, and if anybody has
Uh-huh.
need, they're giving to one another, and nobody demanded anything for their own rights. They gave lovingly and freely to others. And I think if you like kind of get to the heart of what Luke is the one who writes the book of Acts, if you get to the heart of what Luke is describing, what you see is self-sacrificial giving and expecting nothing in return.
Mm.
That was at the heart of it, is they did all these things. Not, like some people, I remember having these debates when I was in graduate school, is that in early church, like it almost sounds a little bit like socialist or communist.
Sounds a little hippie, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because it's like these people are together and hey, we have no food or anything. Well, let's sell this piece of property and let's do this. But it's important to remember that there's no requirement to do that.
Mm.
There's no expectation of, hey, when you join the church, this is what you have to do. That's what you have to do. I'm sure there's plenty of people that didn't do those things.
Yeah.
But at the heart of it is here's people freely sacrificing and giving for one another and not expecting anything in return. I'm not
Mm.
expecting you to pay me back. And that even, I think that goes back to the Old Testament, because one of the things you find in the Old Testament over and over again, and this is not something we talk about a lot, but the idea of loaning someone something with interest is like absolutely forbidden. It's
Mhm.
like all over the law. Like you don't do it. You don't you give to other people. And the New Testament takes that even one step further, where not only am I not going to charge you interest, just don't even repay me.
Mm.
Like you need this, I'm going to give it to you. Even John the Baptist, when people are asking John the Baptist, what should we do to get ready for the coming of the Messiah? John's advice is, well, if you have two coats, give to someone who doesn't have any.
Mm.
Like just give and expect nothing in return. And so that's that loving heart. Again, I think it goes back to that loving heart of God that's reflected in the early church, that yeah, this is love. If I can, if I have something I can give to you, if I can give you myself, if I can give you my presence, if I have somebody I can then I'm going to do that with no motive or no expectation that I would ever receive anything back. I'm going to do this simply because I love you
Yeah.
and because I choose to love you. Because it's not just a feeling, it's a choice that I'm making. I'm going to actively love you by giving of myself and expecting nothing in return from you.
Mm. And that seems to be a huge part of the teaching that, especially Paul, writing these letters to churches that he was, he founded, or that he was helping to, to correct and to guide, and, really talking about like love in a practical sense, that it really was that care and concern for each other. And there's this whole section in some of his letters where he talks about the one another's, like, what do you do for someone else? You carry their burdens, you support each other. And so you sort of have that practical everyday concern, like this is how you treat each other. And then you also have sort of this kind of supernatural or transformational dimension of love, that living in that community of understanding God's love for you, it begins to really change how you understand your life, change how you see people. And that causes these communities to continue to grow as they testify to the fact that Jesus is working in their lives, the Spirit's working in their lives. And it's kind of an interesting thing that we see happening in the church in the past, but also just the church in the present as well.
Yeah. I think to go back to the question you asked in the beginning, what is love? And if we really want a good definition of love, just Google one another in the New Testament.
Mm.
I think the phrase shows up, I think it's like 100 times or something like that. But in terms of the different commands, it's, bear with one another, encourage one another, do like just look at those. And if we do those things for one another, like if we will one another, then
Uh-huh.
you're right. Then it absolutely it begins to change us. We begin to look more like Jesus. Like that's where transformation really happens, as we start to live the way that Jesus lived. Our not only do our behaviors transform, but our heart transforms, and
Mm.
like we begin to change from the inside out when we start to live like that. Yeah, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. It is supernatural what happens in us and around us, and even to our families, in our key relationships, and in our marriages, or with our parents or siblings or coworkers or whatever it is.
Yeah,
When we choose
absolutely.
to love, I mean, you can transform a relationship when you choose to love, um, even if the other person isn't committing to do the same at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many things in life, and I think this really applies to relationships and love, where there are times where our motivation for something is what we get out of it, right? I do this for something. And when we, I think, we really begin to understand God's gift of his grace and his love for us, that changes from, now I'm doing this from this place of what God has done for me. So I'm not looking for what I get. I'm looking to what I can give. And that really, I think, is at the heart of who God is, as you've described, throughout Scripture, and then in the arrival of Jesus, what God has done. That causes us to be able to live freely and openly, so that we can give and share with each other.
Yeah, and I think that would be the key, is to, like, when we look at it in our own life, like, are we defining love through the cross or through the culture?
Mm,
Because, like, in our culture, love is something that you earn. Even
yeah.
even like, you even see it on social media. Like, I want you to love my post, so I'm gonna put up, here's a great post of me and my family, you know, looking cute on our, Joshua Tree trip, or here's this picture. Like, it's like, I want you to give me like, I'm gonna do all these things, show all these things in order to earn it, and that's my motivation. Like, I'm trying to get something. Whereas in the cross, when you look at the story of the cross does nothing for Jesus.
Yeah.
He doesn't need it. It doesn't, like, it's literally for us. He overcomes death for us. And so that's that, like, when I'm loving my wife or my children or my friends or my coworkers or people at church, am I doing it because I want something? Like, I'm motivated. Like, I want your praise, or I want your adoration, or I
Mm.
want to borrow your cabin in the mountains. Like, is there a reason, or is it, no? I'm just doing this because I'm choosing to, and I don't expect anything back from you. I don't need your house in the desert. I don't need to borrow your boat. I just choose to.
Yeah.
And so that would be my encouragement as we think about love, as we get to the season of, focusing on love, is make sure we don't pursue it culturally. Make sure we pursue love the way God shows us clearly through the cross.
Mm, I love that. I think that's a great place to end. Kind of a final thought for us to take away is, we grapple with this huge question of what is love. Well, let's define love by God and what He did through Jesus, and would that prompt us to be people that serve and give and share, and we can make the month of love an incredible month when we choose to have that perspective. Yeah. Well,
Definitely.
everyone, thanks so much for joining us, for tuning in. As always, we like to say, keep reading, keep digging, keep pursuing the text of Scripture, and we're going to see you next time as we explore some of those different messages that we find in the text of Scripture. So, thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for being here, Scott. Thank you so much for sharing.
Stephen, thank you, man. God bless
Yeah.
y'all. Have a great,
God
great
bless.
week.
See you later.